Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show of the Western Standard. Many of us are still wondering why Prime Minister Mark Carney decided to poke U.S. President Donald Trump right as Canada and the U.S. were about to make a deal on trade. First, he legislated supply management off the table. The 230% tariffs that Canada applies to U.S. dairy products to keep Canadian product competitive are a known irritant to Donald Trump. Then, right before the July the 31st trade talks deadline, he promised, with conditions, to recognize Palestine as a legitimate state. Trump is famously pro-Israel. Why would Carney do that? With me today is Yaroslav Baran, co-founder of Ottawa's Pendulum Group of Political Consultants, and in a past life communications director to PM Stephen Harper, who Yaroslav led party communications through 3 national election campaigns. They'd be the ones that Mr. Harper won, right, Yaroslav?
Yes. Well, the first one, in fairness, he knocked the other guys down to a minority, but in the 2 subsequent ones, he won and increased his vote share every step of the way. Yeah.
Some of us would say that when consultants can claim some part in a significant string of election victories, we should take what they say seriously. So we want to hear from you tonight, Yaroslav, about what Mr. Carney is doing. Some people say that he doesn't know what he's doing. Some people say that he knows exactly what he's doing, but he hasn't shared the plot. A hidden agenda, in other words, which would be kind of ironic, really, given the accusations that used to be made at the people you worked for. What do you say about it, Yaroslav? Is he on the ball?
Well, you know what? The trade negotiations between Canada and the United States are not easy, and we can't pretend that they're easy. These are highly complex, and probably the trading relationship between the United States and Canada is more complex than between the United States and any other country, given the volume and given the breadth of commodities and products and services that we do trade. Now, that said, let's take stock of what happened. There was this big August 1st deadline that everybody was really focused on. And that was the date when Donald Trump imposed a broad 35% across the board tariff on imports from Canada. However, I would say, the sky didn't actually fall just because our negotiating team failed to finalize a trade agreement with the U.S. And the biggest reason for that is, the victory lap should go not to the government itself, but to Canadian exporters. Because when this trade war started some months ago, only about 39% of Canadian exports to the U.S. were covered by the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. But the reason it was so low is that many exporters simply didn't bother filling out the paperwork to officially register their exports as being under CUSMA, because there's an extra compliance burden, but with little incremental benefit to doing so, because there's already a relatively free trade environment. So knowing that this deadline was coming, Canadian exporters from sea to sea to sea have been frantically filling out the paperwork, doing the forms, and becoming compliant so that their exports were covered and protected by the free trade umbrella. So by the time we got to that August 1st deadline, somewhere around 85, 90, some would argue 95% of Canadian exports were covered and protected by this CUSMA force shield over the Canadian economy. So this is an accomplishment by Canadian exporters who became compliant to give themselves that protection. Yeah.
Now, that trade deal is, of course, up for renegotiation. Is it in about a year?
Yeah, it's supposed to start in July of 2026, but there's pressure now, most recently from the United States, to start that renegotiation early. So that means we're not out of the woods. We could have additional chapters of this trade war. And even so, regardless of when that CUSMA review begins, we're still not out of the woods. There are certain sectors that are still being pummeled by U.S. tariffs because they're being treated as outside of that CUSMA regime. Steel, aluminum, copper, softwood lumber. So these sectors are still being very, very hardly hit. And this is now the focus of Canada's trade negotiators, trying to find some relief for those sectors, while at the same time announcing domestic assistance packages, loan guarantees and stuff like that as a temporary solution until we can negotiate a way out of this morass.
So if the first question is, can you say again what proportion of Canadian-U.S. trade is covered by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement?
Well, it's a moving target because different exporters are still coming online, and some exporters are being scrutinized and maybe deemed not compliant. So different analysts have different figures, but the figures I keep hearing from reputed sources are somewhere between 85 and 95%.
But so the steel, the aluminium, the softwood lumber, the copper, that's the 5%.
Yeah, that would be outside of that, and they're still being hit very, very hard with in the case of the three metals, 50% tariff, and in the case of softwood, it's a little bit different. They're not technically tariffs; they're duties. They're levied under different legislation from the U.S. and it's different depending on who the exporter is. In some cases, it's 34%. In other cases, it's higher. In other cases, it's lower.
So, where is the auto industry in this division of Canadian assets?
Well, this is also still a moving target. The audio sector is still being negotiated by both sides, but steel and aluminum are really big components in auto manufacturing, and we've all heard the adage that the typical automobile on average goes back and forth across the Canada-U.S. border 8 times before it's ready to be sold. So imagine having that 50% tariff leveled on steel and aluminum parts every single time that it crosses the border. It's just ultimately this is not a sustainable model to continue to have a viable auto sector in Canada if this isn't fixed.
All right. Well, I think we all understand now that in Mr. Trump's view of the world, he needs to have certain strategic industries located within the United States, and I think that means within the lower 48.
If I could double click on copper for a second, because what you're saying is absolutely correct. I mean, the steel tariffs, for example, are motivated by a desire to cultivate and reinforce a domestic U.S. steel industry. Sure, that makes sense from a strategic point of view. But copper is kind of funny. Canadian copper faces a 50% tariff when going to the U.S., but the U.S. barely has a domestic copper industry. Canada currently exports 4 times as much copper to the U.S. Than Americans produce copper domestically. So I would argue the Americans are really shooting themselves in the foot. They are still going to be hugely dependent on Canadian copper imports, except they're now going to be paying a much higher price of their own making because they don't really have a domestic industry yet to be able to offset those volumes.
But presumably the idea of these tariffs is to force U.S. copper users to develop the industry that Trump believes should be there in the United States.
Sure, but that's a long-term game, and that's a lot of pain in the meantime for the U.S. market.
All right. Okay, trade is on the line. Mr. Carney is doing his best. We must assume to keep it there, but I still come back to the original question, which was if you are in the middle of these complex negotiations, why would you, as Prime Minister of Canada, provocatively say we are really proud of our communist system of producing dairy and eggs? So we're not even going to talk about that, whatever you think about it. And by the way, I know you will support Israel, sir, but we think it's time that Palestine was recognized as a state. Why would you do that 2 days before the trade deadline? Is there a method in this madness, or is it really just a kind of dumb thing?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think that is part of a master strategy in trade negotiation. I think that these are both kind of one-offs. I mean, dairy industry, supply management. Mr. Carney's hands were somewhat tied by the passage of legislation by Canada's Parliament in June. Now, it started off as a Bloc Québécois private members bill, but it was supported by members of all parties. So this thing passed basically unanimously. And what that bill does is it forces the government to keep supply management off the table in these trade negotiations and in all other trade negotiations. It's basically it reaffirms the position of industries like dairy as a sacred cow, if you will, and keeps them exempt from being whittled away in negotiations. Now, that doesn't mean that there's some tinkering that can be done around the edges, and there probably will be some, but the system itself cannot be dismantled. I'll give you an example of this. Recently, there was a long-standing dispute going on for 5, 6, 7 years between Canada and New Zealand over dairy. And it was finally resolved in June, but it was resolved in a way that did not dismantle or fundamentally alter the supply management system. But New Zealand is happy with the outcome, and it's just administrative reinterpretations of the implementation of this system, which satisfied the New Zealanders to give them more access to the Canadian dairy market. So some fixes are possible, but not a structural overhaul, if you will. Now, Palestine is something different, and there's
actually, before we go to Palestine, figuratively speaking, I just sort of want to make one comment on that, Yaroslav. Mr. Carney is often represented by those who don't care for his politics as a sinister mastermind, a Svengali character playing the puppets. And you're saying that this incredibly powerful, sinister PM with, some say, a hidden agenda couldn't stop a bill going through Parliament that he didn't like, with all the levers of manipulation that he has at his disposal?
Well, I think it's because he did like it. The political value of protecting supply management is huge in Canadian politics. Okay,
so it wasn't that he was outmaneuvered. It's just that he sort of let good things happen, and somebody else is responsible.
Not at all. If he were to oppose a bill or stop this bill, many argue that it would be political suicide for him in the next election in Quebec. That he would lose all of his Quebec seats, or at least everything outside of Montreal.
Oh, right.
So, yeah, supply management is hugely politically important, especially in Quebec and to some degree in Eastern Ontario.
Okay, Palestine. Why did he do what he did?
Well, I honestly do not believe that this was a trade negotiation maneuver. Not at all. There's been significant pressure, international pressure in recent weeks, given what's been happening with the stunted delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza. And this was really started by French President Macron. Macron, who, by the way, has a massive Arab and Muslim constituency in France, and that translates into political pressure. He started the ball saying, we've had it. Something must be done with this humanitarian crisis, and France will recognize a Palestinian state when the UN General Assembly opens up in September. And he started to court other world leaders, such as Keir Starmer in the UK and Mark Carney in Canada, to follow suit to create sort of a united front. Now, Mr. Starmer said he sort of came out with a compromise solution. He said, if something is not done, if humanitarian aid doesn't flow and flow big, then we will follow France's lead and we will do likewise. Mark Carney took a third, more nuanced approach. He came closer to France's position and said that Canada will recognize a Palestinian state, but with certain conditions. For example, that Palestine would have to disarm, that there would have to be free and fair elections, that all the hostages would have to be released, and that Hamas would be forbidden from contesting the elections. Now, keep in mind, there's also a very significant voter base in Canada that is applying the kind of similar pressure on the Liberals that President Macron has felt in France. Remember, former Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly, she was the first one seized with this issue, and she personally had a disproportionately high number of Arab and Muslim voters in her own riding. So that kind of internal political pressure is pretty massive. And I would argue that that is really what is motivating this. He's trying to walk a balanced line, because on the surface, it seems like a reasonable proposal. It is aligned with longstanding Canadian foreign policy that a two-state solution is ultimately the way forward. So it's not technically a departure from that policy. And the conditions seem very reasonable on the surface. Release the hostages, Hamas cannot contest elections, and so on. The issue here is that it is a big, big deal to bestow official diplomatic recognition of another state, for example, state of Palestine. And you cannot bestow and revoke that, every couple months based on circumstances on the ground. So once that recognition is given by Canada, it's basically permanent. So what's to stop a new Palestinian government from, for example, agreeing to these conditions, and then 2 years later, 3 years later, suddenly we see Hamas resurface as a major political party contesting elections? Like, Canada can't really, bestow and revoke diplomatic recognition like turning off and on a light switch. It doesn't work that way. So this is a really big move and should not be taken very lightly.
Do you suppose that let's just play with the idea that Mr. Carney had trade on his mind, but this was more on his mind. Maybe there wasn't a deal with the Americans in the offing anyway, so it didn't really matter whether he upset them by offering this conditional recognition of Palestine.
Yeah.
Could that be the case?
It seems to me that this recognition of Palestine move was entirely separate from trade, that he was trying to satisfy, domestic political pressure in certain quarters, as well as genuinely, in his mind, trying to address the acute humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The problem is that this announcement has really antagonized Israel and a whole lot of Israel supporters. Many argue that it rewards the October 7th attack, that it rewards terrorist activity. As one analyst from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute recently wrote, that it effectively creates a forward operating base for Iran right on Israel's doorstep. So these are some of the implications, albeit unintended for Mr. Carney, of taking this kind of a bold step. And even though Donald Trump has not said that it will impact Canada-U.S. trade negotiations, the fact remains Canada is one of few countries still without a deal, and Mr. Trump did publicly criticize Mr. Carney's announcement that he will recognize Palestine. So implicitly, it's pretty reasonable to conclude that it is having an impact on the Canada-U.S. trade negotiations.
Fair enough. Let's move the window a little bit, Yaroslav. We've now had a little more than 3 months of Mr. Carney post-election, plus a month before. He has made a number of bold promises that we're going to build Canada strong. There will be this, there will be that, there will be subsidies for steel. We'll look after the softwood lumber. We're going to build houses. We're going to build so many houses. It's almost starting to sound like Mr. Trump in full flow. He's made a lot of promises, and yet when the basic wealth generators, like pipelines, like the energy industry, to be more specific, are very much still in the balance. And that deep down in his heart, he doesn't like the energy industry because he thinks it's responsible, or so he says, he thinks it's responsible for global warming. When you put it all together, is there actually a viable plan there, or is this government by announcement Trudeau style?
Well, it would appear, at least now, that Mr. Carney has accepted the realism of current circumstances and is parking his hostility towards Canada's energy sector, because he's saying all the right things in terms of the need to build things like pipelines and other nation-building, economic facilitating projects, things like east-west electrical grids and others. But pipelines and the petroleum industry are massive to Canada's economy, and he has not been at all hostile to them outwardly the way that his predecessor, Justin Trudeau, was. But we'll see if that sticks. Many would argue that his actions now are irreconcilable with what he has spent the last 10 years talking about on the international lecture circuit, saying we need to aggressively move towards a Trudeau model carbon tax internationally, that is the way forward to fight climate change. And that would be antithetical to Canada's energy sector. So it seems that he's being motivated by realpolitik, by the realism of circumstances right now. And on the one hand, that's positive. On the other hand, you cannot blame political watchers for being a little bit skeptical that this is going to last. Moreover, if he really wants to demonstrate leadership, that he is going to build these massive nation-building projects like pipelines, I would argue it's incumbent upon him to work on people like the Premier of Quebec and the Premier of British Columbia, who are still saying no pipelines through my territory, and wrestling them to the ground, saying this is necessary and you've got to play ball on this. Otherwise, we can end up in a situation where he's saying, hey, I'm the good guy, I'm the one pushing this, it ain't me, it's a premier stopping it. So he gets the best of all worlds. He gets the public relations benefit for theoretically supporting the energy sector without any pipelines actually being built.
Constitutionally speaking, here in Alberta, we take the view that the federal government, in the person of Mr. Carney now, but before him, Mr. Trudeau, has no business in certain parts of provincial jurisdiction. Premier Smith famously uses the line that the federal government should stay in its lane.
Yes.
And we hold to that very, very firmly. But now, when it comes to getting a pipeline through to the coast, we actually wouldn't mind if Mr. Carney gone into BC's lane and into Quebec's lane. So where is the constitutional authority really lay for things like this?
Well, constitutionally, provinces control things like pipelines, provided that pipeline is entirely within that province's boundaries. Once that pipeline or other things, highways, whatever, cross a provincial boundary, then it becomes a dual jurisdiction issue. Now, provinces still have blocking authority, and that's why that moral suasion from the prime minister can become a very powerful tool to win over those premiers. But you know what? It's also becoming a more competitive environment. If British Columbia, for example, continues to block pipelines of Alberta and Saskatchewan products to overseas markets, Manitoba is saying, heck, send it here. We'll build a deep sea port in Churchill and export via the Hudson Bay. I mean, Premier Ford is talking about a deep sea port near Moosonee on James Bay, again, using Hudson's Bay as an export tool to get products out to market.
We're just about out of time, Yaroslav, but when Parliament resumes in September, tell me 3 things you expect to see in the throne speech.
Well, actually, I don't think we're going to get a different throne speech. I think it's going to be technically a continuation of the previous session, but it's going to be very different in that Pierre Poilievre is going to be back in the House of Commons. He's got a by-election coming up, which I expect he'll win handily. So we're going to be back to a traditional dynamic of government and opposition leaders sparring in Parliament, because Carney largely got a pretty free ride in June. So that's going to be the biggest difference. There's also going to be intense political pressure from the United States for the Carney government, for Parliament to pass C2, the Border Control Act, which it's going to be contentious. Yeah, it does some good things about strengthening the border and tackling cross-border crime, but there are also some significant civil liberties implications in that bill. Those are probably the 2 big ones. And the final one is we're going to see how this whole nation-building projects thing evolves. The premiers are so far collecting project ideas that they are going to pitch to the federal government, but it's ultimately going to be the federal government that decides which of these projects are going to move forward under this new federal fast-track legislation. So, get ready for possibly some fireworks and horse trading between the provinces and the federal government for access to the Bill C5 nation-building fast-track.
We'll all be gathered around the television watching it when it happens. Don't worry. Yaroslav, as always, it's been a great pleasure to hear your insights. You have much wisdom to give us. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure is always to be here. Thanks.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.